right. So today we're going to be talking about a very special and inspiring person. Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. So, episode 2, season 2, right? Well, I should say episode 1, season 2, because we call the other one episode 0. But nonetheless, I think this is still an introduction to the course.
Right.
And we're going to talk about someone who we both just found out about in the last couple of years, and turned out to be somebody who's very well known to Americans in general. But what we learned about him was something very special, and that's what we want to discuss about today. And the person that we are discussing today is Admiral James Stockdale.
Mm-hmm.
And do you want to talk about the famous interview conspiracy?
Yeah, I mean, so I think in the public eye, most people remember James Stockdale from his, he was Ross Perot's running mate. And so most people probably have the memory of him participating in the vice presidential debate in 1992. This is back when Al Gore was the vice presidential candidate, and Dan Quayle was the vice presidential candidate. And Stockdale was a third-party vice presidential candidate, and he was sort of in the middle podium. And in fact, he, up until recently, his memory in my mind was of somebody who had participated as a third-party vice presidential candidate and had not performed well, is the way I had perceived it.
Right.
And in fact, fun was made of him afterward. And it is only later, after I've embarked on, philosophical discourse and reading and stumbling upon this philosophical course that he put together for the Naval War College, that I realized what his stature really was within military circles. So I should say that he was very well known within military circles and even political circles, because he was well known. And it was after doing this philosophical reading that I went back, learned about the fact that he'd put together a course at the Naval War College focusing on philosophy and getting the benefits from that from a leadership standpoint, really giving the future military leaders a scaffolding, a framework to use to make sound decisions in very high intensity situations. But I think most people remember Stockdale from his vice presidential bid, but his profile within the realm of the military domain and even within the academic and philosophical domain looms very large. And this was a very special individual.
Oh, yeah. The funny part is the part that everybody remembers and made fun of was his opening statements. The candidates asked to introduce themselves, and his famous opening line was, "Who am I? What am I doing here?"
Right.
And
they got a big laugh.
They got a big laugh, and even afterward, everybody was making fun of him, saying that was he was probably not sane, and all that. And once you get to know who he was, that statement that he made, the question that he asked, actually makes so much sense.
Right. It's he meant it, and he was using a double meaning.
That's correct.
He was talking about the implications of that question. I'm seriously asking yourself that question, but he was also contextualizing his perspective on the situation, because as he quickly points out in that debate, which I recently rewatched just to kind of get a sense for his performance and how he was received, he was bringing up some very valid points, and he pointedly expressed this idea that he is not a politician, and that he was really somebody who was more steeped in sort of the military realm, but the language, the coinage that he used during that debate was very much of somebody who had done deep philosophical reading. Yeah. And so some of the words that he said, which probably don't carry as much weight to the public ear, because he was talking about things like courage,
right.
To somebody who's been reading philosophy, you realize that what he was talking about were very, very deep things. And I think it unfortunately went over the heads of a lot of people in that audience, and even in the TV audience. Yeah. But when you go back and listen to what he was saying, you realize this guy was pointing out some very deep issues.
Oh, yeah. So, enough of the suspense, I guess. I guess we should probably talk about who he was and what is this thing that he did and why is he such a great person. History has few individuals who have actually been tested to the limits of what a human can tolerate. And they were able to sustain that with grace. And, Socrates is one of them. Cato the Younger is one of them. He was very famously a Stoic. Marcus Aurelius. More recently, Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King,
Mandela, who we
Nelson
invoke
Mandela.
frequently, right? It's sort of a prototypical.
And James Stockdale is in that group, and there are others that, we have not mentioned here, but James Stockdale is in that group.
Yeah.
And it is worth getting to know their lives and what they've done and the gravity of what they were able to accomplish and achieve. So we're talking about Admiral Stockdale. So he was a naval pilot and was a hotshot naval pilot, just like you could expect from the movies. And he was about 38 when he decided that he wanted to participate in a career beyond the military and going into like international relations. So he wanted to take a college course at Stanford. They were given the opportunity to do that. And so he ended up in Stanford learning international relations. And he got bored really quickly. He didn't think of himself as like a wheeling and dealing kind of guy, and he didn't like any of the courses. So he was just, walking around campus, figuring out, what else he could do, what else is going on, just feeling things out. And he walks into the philosophy department. And he had no idea about any of this. He was like, this is not for a modern day fighter pilot like me, But he just walking around and he runs into the person who turns out to be one of his biggest mentors, Dr. Rhinelander, who calls him in and they just start having a conversation.
Philosophy professor.
He's a philosophy professor at Stanford. Yeah. And he mistook Stockdale to be another professor. He used to say, "Are you a professor?" He's like, "No, I'm just cruising around. What is this about?" And then they start having a conversation. And he goes from having a conversation with him to realizing that the questions that Rhinelander proposed and the conversations they had, that's what he wanted to do. Those are the questions of life that he didn't know the answers to, and he should know those answers to. So he decided that he's going to quit this international relations course and take up philosophy. He's going to fast track the philosophy. So him and Rhinelander used to sit and do extra classes together to kind of keep up and stuff. And they spoke about, they discussed all these topics, all the great conversations of, stuff that we've discussed, from Descartes to, from Plato to Aristotle to Descartes to Kant. They discussed all of this stuff. And toward the end of that course, Rhinelander, it's like a farewell, he's leaving. Stockdale is leaving. So Rhinelander says, "I have something for you that..."
leaving to go to war.
Leaving to go to war, I think, yeah. He says, "I have something for you that you would like, that would do you good." And he reaches up from the top shelf and picks out this very thin book and hands it to him. And it's the Enchiridion. And he says that this book, Rhinelander tells Stockdale, that this book is the writings of a Stoic philosopher. Stockdale knew a little bit of Stoicism by then. He talks to him about Cato. He talks to him about Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and says Enchiridion is actually the words of Epictetus, not written by him. And because it came from Rhinelander, he had the utmost respect for the book, so he read the book, and it made a big impression on him. And so Stockdale always kept a copy of the Enchiridion with him and would read it multiple times, and he would keep going through it and keep and learning. Every time he read it, he learned something new about it. Yeah. And so who was Epictetus, right? And what is the Enchiridion? So Epictetus was a Roman Stoic. He was actually born a slave. and I think he was from one of the Greek. He was from one of the Greek states. Nonetheless, he ends up in Rome. He's sold into slavery, and while he is being transported to Rome, he's actually beaten mercilessly. He actually breaks his leg. He's actually a cripple, and he's sold to a nobleman who is actually very close to Nero, and Nero famously is the Mad King, right? And so. And then he eventually, his master treats him brutally, but also ends up educating him. So he ends up getting educated and starts. He's in these circles of these people who are actually cultured and educated and things like that. So he learns a lot, picks up a lot from them. And when he sees the vulgarity that exists with the super wealthy, he is kind of driven away from that. And so when there's a fall of Rome, he basically extricates himself from that situation. He kind of wins his freedom, and then starts his own school of philosophy. And he's actually driven out of that, and he's exiled. And when he's in exile, he is very much like Socrates, where he is he forms a cult following, and very rich young men are sent to him to be educated. And what he tells is the curriculum that he imparts has got nothing to do with money. It's got nothing to do with power or religion, but it's to do with happiness and unhappiness, and has to do with freedom and slavery, and things like that. So it's basically just Stoic principles. And he famously doesn't write anything down. He doesn't believe that he should write things down and preach to people. But one of his followers, a guy called Arian, hears him out and says, "Man, what this guy is talking about is amazing. This is the kind of stuff that generations should have access to." So he, with Epicurus's consent, says, "I'm going to start documenting what you write." And so he writes 8 volumes of what's called the Discourses by Epicurus, out of which only 4 survive. And what he does at the end of it, Arian writes a short manual. It's called the Enchiridion,
right?
Which I think it stands for manual.
The handbook.
The handbook or manual,
loosely translate to the handbook or at hand.
At hand, yeah.
Because it was right. The Arian was sort of thinking, this would be. I wish someone should write a handbook based off what we're learning from Epictetus.
And for busy people to read and go. And I've read it. You've read it, right? And
several times.
I think, and I keep a copy of it with me. And it's that was the thing that we did in our little book club. And each of those little short paragraphs, man, is just full of just it's amazing.
The wisdom per paragraph ratio in that book is very high.
And it does talk about that, right? Talks about how to be free when you are imprisoned. How can a man be happy in prison? Right? That's exactly the question. And so how does that come? So how circling back to Stockdale?
So coming back to Stockdale.
That's right. So Stockdale has his book in hand and he reads it. He also has a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey that he keeps next to him. There's one more book that he has next to him, and he goes to war, Vietnam War, and he leads a squadron of fighter jets. And he is actually doing a sortie mission over Vietnam. He runs into flak, and he has to bail out of his aircraft.
He gets shot down.
He gets shot down, and as he's coming down, and he opens up his chute, and he has a few minutes before he hits the ground. And he says these were as he was going down, he was thinking in his mind that he's going to leave the world of technology and enter into the world of Epictetus as he's landing into this Vietnamese village, and he can see people kind of running toward him, and there's a short fight. He is bound, and he's
taken prisoner.
He's taken as a prisoner of war, and now he's in prison. And so he has in his mind, he has engraved into his mind the words of Epictetus, and he uses those words to be free in prison. For he spends 8 years in the dreaded Hanoi Hilton, and because of what he learned, he's able to put his Stoic principles into effect. And when in situations where a regular person like me would completely crumble, he's able to have strength to withstand what's called taking the ropes. That was torture, absolutely inhumane living conditions. and not only survive that, but also lead a bunch of other prisoners of war and keep up their morale.
Right.
And he spent 8 years in, his finally released. What I'm going to leave that in the show notes, is his speech that he gave, one of the commencement speeches that he gave. Yeah. It's called Courage Under Fire, and it is a beautiful read. The end of it, by the end of it, I was in tears.
We should leave a link to it. I've watched it. It's been a while, but I remember watching it.
It has our famous poem at the end. Yeah, so Invictus. It has Invictus at the end of it, and it is very profound, moving. But when he got done from his imprisonment, and he came back stateside, he didn't stop. Any lesser person would have just done. He had played his part in life, but he decided to move on from that and then be able to. He actually created the course, the Foundation of Moral Obligation course, which is one of the most famous courses even now, most popular courses in the U.S. Naval War College. I was actually in correspondence with the person who runs it right now for a short period of time, and everybody is in awe of James Stockdale, no question.
Yeah, it's like this extremely popular, well-received course.
Even now, the guys who run it, talk about him, and it's all. He is a modern-day philosopher, as close as you could get to someone like Socrates, someone that obviously he is past, but someone that you could touch and feel, who lived and walked and breathed the air that we do now, and lived in a modern world, but had the bearings of a stoic philosopher. So that is the introduction to Admiral Stockdale and the course, the Foundation of Moral Obligation course. And the hope is, when I spoke to the person who currently runs the course, Tom Gibbons, it is the hope still is that one goes through this course and is able to then make the kind of decisions that are very difficult to make for a human being. Decisions that would lead to you doing an act which could be either good or bad, good or evil. That could lead to freedom or slavery. That could lead to happiness or unhappiness. And how does one make that choice? How does one live with that choice?
Right. So, there's a lot of fascinating things about this story. For example, one of the compelling things about Stockdale is that he was a sort of flesh and bone proof of concept, meaning he had essentially made use of his Stoic principles, what he had learned from reading from Stoic philosophy, and essentially he was put in the crucible. He was in the absolute depths of adversity, and he ascribes his ability to endure through that to the Stoic philosophical teachings that he learned from that, simple handbook that was handed to him at Stanford, almost in passing, right before, heading into a war zone. This is somebody who's actually been through that road of trials, the trials and tribulations that many of us encounter. So the compelling part of the story is that I think most people who are listening have some sense that they have difficulties in their life. Like, how can I better handle adversity? How can I rise above the challenges of my life without feeling like all is lost, or that I'm unable to avoid common mistakes. And so that is this gets me to this idea of what is the point? Because the main critique I often run into when I talk about philosophy with people is, well, what's the point? You're talking about these deep concepts, and how is that relevant? How is that practical? And so what he represents is somebody who's been through the crucible, a living example of somebody who's made use of those principles. And now this is then coming out of that, he goes into academia and puts together a course that says, well, this would be useful for future military leaders. But as you and I both talked about, when it comes to philosophical teaching, none of this is unique to warriors. Mm-hmm. None of this is unique to wars. Mm-hmm. These are all human endeavors. It's actually fascinating when you think about it. Here's this guy flying a machine, hundreds of miles an hour in the air with all kinds of technologies around. It's stuff that Epicurus, as an ancient Greek, would have never in a million years imagined. And yet the principles that he outlined, as ancient as they were, were just as validated, just as grounded, just as useful, just as preservative as they were from the day he wrote it. I mean, that's just mind-boggling and fascinating to me.
That's correct.
Anyway,
2,000 years.
Yeah.
And one could argue that the writings or the discourses of Epictetus didn't all originate with Epictetus.
Yeah.
If you look at Stoic philosophy, that you can see roots of it in what Aristotle talks about, what Plato talks about, what Socrates talks about, going back.
Right, because even before Epictetus, there was work that preceded his work too, and he was informed by
Everybody's
that.
building on the works of someone else.
Right.
And so, yes, it was what Admiral Stockdale was able to do was to show us how useful philosophy can be.
Mm-hmm.
We all like to look at our lives thinking about this life the way it is right now. It's not going to change. But the only thing that is constant is change. One could be in the highs of highs today and be in the lows of lows tomorrow. Now, how does one deal with both of that? How do you deal with the highest of highs and deal with the lowest of lows? It's all based on what one's understanding of philosophy. If one understands Stoic principles, simply that, things that are in your control,
right,
and things that are not in your control. The things that are not in your control are the ones that we always are anxious about, are worried about. We want to control it. If they're not in your control, be indifferent toward them. Right? Because you cannot control them.
Like that's a big ask, right? I mean, it takes training and it takes practice. But the ability, there's two things to that. First, there's the knowledge that there is an advantage to preserving your own sense of well-being and tranquility by relentlessly identifying the factors in your life that are outside your control and focusing on the things that are within your control. So that's the first guidance. But the second one is to understand that you need some degree of knowledge or wisdom to be able to identify adequately what are those things, because some of the mistakes that many of us make are in worrying or thinking that we have control over things that we don't. And once we realize that we don't, it sort of alleviates us from some of the cognitive and emotional and physical burden of toiling and exerting ourselves to fight this event or problem or challenge that is really not in our hands to make a major difference about it. At best, we influence those things. So what it does, it sort of stratifies your life into these are the things worth putting your effort into, and these are the things that you're not. That you're better off focusing on learning how to accept these things and how to persevere through them.
So even if you just talk about that, right, of what is in your control and what's not in your control, and you're right, it takes some amount of wisdom to kind of understand that. It takes a lot of introspection actually to understand that is what I would say. So if you think about things that we believe that are in our control, we believe that our position is in our control, our name, our popularity, our stature is in our control, our wealth is in our control, property is in our control, our family is in our control. We believe our own body parts,
health,
is in our control. Now let's think about that. Are they in fact in your control? Health, there's no saying. If you're healthy today, you could be unhealthy tomorrow. It's happened to all of us all the time. No matter what you do, no matter how healthy you try to keep yourself, cancer is looming large, and we're all going to die at some point. Our wealth, right? For folks whose money is tied up in the markets, you don't control the markets. There's so many factors that control the money. You don't know if tomorrow bankruptcy is going to hit you square in the face. We've had these discussions about how people who have had wealth lose wealth. That doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot do the things that you're supposed to do to maintain that, but it's not necessarily in your control. Fame, that is completely based on someone else. Right. You don't get to decide whether you're famous.
Status. And sometimes things happen that affect both. I mean, the pandemic, my gosh. I mean,
what am I talking
talk about something that's going to affect health and the economy. So
everything.
Stoic principles would actually give you the guiding points to, persevering through situations like that. So Because what you can control is how you react to things, or the opinions you form about the things that happen around
That's
you.
what I was coming to.
Right.
So these are the things that you cannot control then. But these are the things that you spend all your time worrying about. What would people say? What would people think? How, if I lose money, gain money, buy this stock, don't buy that stock, this job, that job, money. And just think about the things that are actually in your control. So the only things that are in your control are your thoughts, the emotions that arise, and the actions, right? And if you look at those things, the most important there is thought, and you get to choose your thoughts. You're in control of your thoughts,
Yeah.
and those thoughts can be rational, or they could be irrational. We would all like to believe that we are rational beings. Rational beings are those who can make the determination between good and evil. So let's talk about rational thoughts, right? When it comes to things that are good or evil, that's when you are in control. You can choose actions that you believe are in the direction of good. If there's an action that doesn't lead to neither good nor evil, be indifferent to it.
Right. Right. Because the actions themselves can have implications that are not in your control, or that just have essentially an equivocal impact, right? So vanilla versus chocolate ice cream. All right. Well, that's probably not equivocal, but how much you eat probably has an impact.
But the other thing about it is whether or not you like chocolate or vanilla, it is in your control to not eat too much, to not seek it out and eat it all the time. You see what I mean?
Right.
That is a thought. That's rational thinking.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Right.
Similarly, one could look at their job. One could look at their status the same way. The job, whether it leads to good or evil, that's a choice that you can make. That's based on wisdom. That's based on rational thinking. If it neither leads to good nor leads to evil, it's indifferent. Be indifferent to your job. If it leads to evil, don't do it. If it leads to good, pursue.
Yeah.
And while you're on the path to that good, you are going to meet all sorts of resistance.
Yeah.
You're going to have all sorts of problems, from EMR to your administrator telling you that you're not generating enough RVUs,
right.
To all of those things. But if you truly believe that your path is the path of good, and it in fact is, you have to have the rational thinking. Because if it's not, and you're fooling yourself, then you're not being stoic about it. But if the work that you're doing matters and is in the line of good, you should be able to persevere through, like Admiral Stockdale did, through the ropes, through being imprisoned.
Yeah.
If he could survive torture, privation, just so that he could be on the path of good, be able to lead his men, keep the morale up, if he could do that, we should also be able to kind of deal with some of the day-to-day encumbrances and problems and stuff that we deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it was...
If you're on the path of good.
Yeah. I mean, because what he was able to do was to preserve their moral sense. I mean, that's what sustained them. And so this kind of brings me back to the point that I was making initially, as far as the, there's 2 points. There's one about what is the point of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I guess I could summarize it. His story and the story of many, many, many others really just illustrate the fact that the point of reading philosophy is because I think it does 2 things. And we've talked about this, I think, to some degree in previous episodes, but sort of like there's a guidance effect and a consolation with both. But I think there's probably 2 better words. There's philosophy sort of preserves you, meaning it helps you avoid making irrational decisions, or to make easy mistakes that could lead to a cascade of unintended, negative, harmful consequences that either affect you or others in a harmful way, and in either physically or psychologically or moral ways. Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of preserving effect that philosophical understanding gives you, because it gives you the wherewithal to identify the risks, the hazards around you that many people maybe don't see. So it preserves, but it also helps you persevere, because what we all know is that even if you have a perfect system of judgment and action and decision making, fate conspires, to put you in situations where something bad happens, and then you have to decide what to do. And so philosophy also helps with that part of it. So it helps you persevere through the road of trials that many of us find ourselves in. So it preserves you from the mistakes. But when you do make them, or when you do find yourself in a challenge or facing an obstacle or facing some negative, untoward outcome, something that you feel like is negatively impacting your well-being, well, the philosophical teaching also helps you persevere through that. And so that's how I would respond to that question, that critique when I get it.
And that perseverance is resilience.
Yeah, right. And so, and then the other critique, though, and we could talk more about this because you could talk at length about this, but some people actually will, when they first hear about Stoicism, usually if you've read through it, you realize that it's a little bit of a oversimplification to think that Stoicism is just trained indifference. And it's not that at all, right? I mean, because a Stoic would say that there is value for virtuous behavior. I mean indifference in the common parlance, meaning that you just don't care about anything. That's not what Stoicism is. Stoicism is really about being able to identify what is within your control and what is not. And then those things that are within your control, that domain, that's where you exercise your virtues. That is where you, try to behave in a way that is consistent with right action, moral action. This is where the wisdom, courage, temperance, justice all inhabit that space of the things that are within your control. And then the other side of things, where you're sort of identifying the things that you're not under control, that's just really a system of trying to keep yourself from being perturbed unnecessarily, right? There's no point in worrying about things that you, at best, in your own mind, could maybe barely influence, but you certainly can't control.
Yeah. I'll give you an example, and then we can talk about what were the trials that Admiral Stockdale faced. Because, your first part you said was it gives you consolation, and the second was it allows you to persevere, right?
Yeah, there's like a guidance, which you could say preserves you, and then there's the consolation, which you could also say is perseverance.
Right.
Yeah.
So coming back to, I had this encounter today with one of my patients, and he was admitted because there was concern that he was having a heart attack.
Yeah, we should disclose that we're both on call right now. So
both on call right now. He was, and this was he was told he was having, this was a heart attack that, quote unquote, heart attack a couple of weeks ago, and he was then underwent some testing and stuff, and was found to have significant blockages in his in the blood vessels of his heart, his coronary arteries, and so the plan for him was that based on the amount of blockages that he had and the number of arteries that were involved, that he would be best served by bypass surgery, coronary artery bypass grafting. And so then he was discharged home and was brought back to get the surgery coming next week. And so he's back in the hospital, and so I was having a discussion with him, and he had some questions about this. He felt that he wanted to get stents. He didn't want to get bypass surgery. And we had a discussion about why one is better than the other, why bypass surgery trumps stents and stuff like that. But I don't want to get too technical in the terms. But I said, and I stopped the conversation there, and I said, when someone tells you have blockages in the blood vessels of your heart, all you can think about is that you want to get rid of these blockages. But whether the fact that you have the blockages, the fact that these blockages are going to be dealt with in a certain way, or not be dealt with, are not in your control. The only person who can decide that, essentially, at this point is the surgeon. The surgeon is going to perform the surgery, bypass those blockages. But the treatment for what you have is actually not just the bypass surgery. There are things in your control that you can do.
Oh, yeah.
The only things that are in your control right now is the fact that you need to, your diabetes. You gotta treat your diabetes, and that is through eating better, exercising, losing weight. You gotta quit smoking. You used to smoke. That's within your control. You can quit smoking, and you got to take your medications, and you got to choose to be mindful. Because he had a panic attack a couple of days ago because of all of this that's going on in his life. Yeah,
sure.
And he also wanted to, prior to his heart attack, he was looking at houses. He wanted to move his house, and he wanted to buy a new house. And I told him those are one of the most stressful things to do. And so, so I was like, what is not in your control are these blockages. You had him for the past year, 2 years, maybe even longer. You didn't even know you had it. Right. If I were to tell you a year and a half ago that you'll be having a conversation with a cardiologist here in a year and a half, you would have laughed me off.
Yeah.
But here you are. You have no control over that. But what you can control is your life. And it was like you could see the penny drop. It was like, you're right.
The light click on.
Yeah. Because he was sitting there and twiddling his thumbs. He was anxious because the surgery is not till a couple of days, and all he could think of was the surgery. And after we had this conversation, it changed his mind. He started thinking about all the things that he could do. His wife was in the room, and she was thinking about all the things that she could do, and brings control back. That's just a small example. Yeah,
that's a great example, because so looking at that situation through the lens of Stoicism, it would be right. The coronary artery disease, the extent of the blockage is not at this point not under your control.
Right.
And so again, a misinterpreted idea of Stoicism would be, well, is the instruction then to just not care about that? Right. No, the instruction is to know that it's not in your control, so that all that energy you spend on expressing and dwelling and ruminating on your regret and all the things that you've done are wrong, that's wasted effort, right? And it's actually now a great opportunity to say, look, I have a chance now to course correct.
Right.
So the Stoic would say, yes, I don't have to waste any intellectual or emotional effort on the regret as about the fact as it led to my coronary artery disease, but now I have an opportunity to exert my free will on the things that are within my control, which is eating right, improving my lifestyle, that sort of thing. So that's exactly how a Stoic would look like.
That's correct.
Would look at the situation, right? So this is a good example to also say that this is why Stoicism is not just sort of like this passive acceptance of all the things that happen. In fact, Stoicism is a way to alleviate yourself from unnecessary stress and anxiety, and focus on the things that you can learn, gain, or grow from the challenges that we run into in life.
But to take it one step forward, this is how to use Stoic principles. This example that we gave about right. Your health and your fitness is a way to look inward. And everybody looks at Stoicism that way. How does one use Stoic principles to get through the day? But that's not what Stoicism was for. Yeah. Stoicism actually is looking outside into the world. You cannot be Stoic unto others. Mm-hmm. You cannot be indifferent unto the world. Yeah. You can only be Stoic unto yourself, saying that, oh, woe is me. Why am I being put through this? Why am I having these issues? That is what Stoicism prevents you from doing. Blaming the world for your problems, or even elevating your problems ahead. And so if you are indifferent to your own misfortune, what are you focusing on? You're focusing on the common good. Mm-hmm. So you sacrifice yourself for the common good. That's what Stoicism is about. You're right. It is about virtues. It's about how a Stoic would not be indifferent to the fact that he is not being virtuous. Mm-hmm. A Stoic would not be indifferent to the fact that he's not being he's not on the path of good.
Exactly.
And
that's a great way to put it. Yes.
It would not be indifferent toward evil. Mm-hmm. You see. So that's why I said my example is kind of small. It's kind of pity because it's about one patient and his coronary artery disease.
Yeah, but it's a good one. I mean, it's a very practical, easily grasped example. But yeah, there's this idea that Stoicism sort of transcends the external and internal world, right? Correct. So even your own thinking about the things of the events around you, when you viewed them through the lens of Stoicism, there's an orientation toward focusing effort, exertion, however you want to describe it, on the things that are within your control, and then exercising virtue within that space.
As a matter of fact, Stoics actually feel elated when they're able to circumvent obstacles.
Right.
When Marcus Aurelius says very famously, an obstacle is the way. Mm-hmm. And what he means by that is not that facing obstacles is the way to go about life. That's not what he means exactly by that. But welcoming an obstacle, saying, I'm going to use my Stoic principles. Come at me, obstacle. Try your best, but I'm going to remain stoic.
Right.
And when you are able to remain stoic through that obstacle, you pat yourself on the back when you get on the other side. So there is that moment of elation. It's actually not this, stoic, absolutely pan-faced going through life saying, I don't care about anything.
So the few times that I've had conversations about Stoicism with people that have not, read done the reading, that's usually the first wall that I have to break through, because they're like, well, that sounds like some sort of passive acceptance of things, and how useful is that really? And so it's walking them through that. No, there's actually a really deep and important distinction here made. So
this is obviously, Stoicism is just one type of philosophy. I mean,
right, it's just one dimension.
One dimension of it.
Things we're going to be talking about.
It is obviously something that you and me are both, very we are influenced by it, and it's I find it very useful. It has really changed the way I deal with frustrations. And I'm able to I'm able to lead myself out of this, this vortex of this, or this of self, of guilt, of frustration, or anger. As you start sinking in it, you can suddenly be like, nope, I'm going to walk out of this. This is ridiculous, because this is not within my control. And you step out of it, and that is that. It takes practice.
Yeah, it takes, right. That's the other point too. And I don't think we've talked enough about that, which is there's this idea that, well, if I read the Enchiridion and I read some other Stoic philosophy, boom, I'm good to go. And it actually takes a lot of practice. I mean, this is a very aspirational.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the pinnacle Stoic, never existed. I mean, it's something that you have to really reach forward, and you have to practice at the small level and kind of work your way up. But I agree. I think for situations where people are dealing with that negative self-talk, with that feeling of being overwhelmed, having a Stoic mindset completely clarifies and alleviates those situations. But it's not an instant thing. It does take some work and practice. But some people just need a little practical framework to reframe and get a different perspective on their own situation. And frankly, it triggers the very important introspection that I think a lot of us either don't know we should be doing, or just don't know how to do it.
Right.
And so these Stoic principles give you like the perfect triggers for self-reflection.
So coming back to it, you had mentioned about philosophy and how it helped Admiral Stockdale, or how it helps us. And I want to just bring it back to the story of Admiral Stockdale. So during their term as prisoners of war, they were being tortured. And one of the biggest things were that these guys would feel guilty when, under pain of torture, they would actually divulge information.
Right.
And then they would come back and they would be racked with guilt. It wasn't the fact that they were put under the ropes or put through the ropes, is the term that they would use, but it's the fact that they felt that they had betrayed their fellow prisoners of war and their nation. And if Stockdale relied on the teachings of Epicurus to talk about how that's not the case, and how they can still maintain their moral compass and their will despite being put through this kind of torture, the systematic torture, this privation. And so that's what the Enchiridion was able to do for him, was to build those principles in him, and then eventually keep him resilient through all of this as well.
Right.
So that was that. And then so bringing it back to why are we discussing this, and how does this affect the course? So the thing that Stoicism talks about is, if you read Stoicism, if you just read the Enchiridion, you're right. People could just take the idea that this is just about indifference, or things that are in my control and things that are not my control for my benefit. And one of the things that is a preamble to Stoic philosophy is the Platonic dialogues, the teachings of Socrates.
Right.
But what is in fact good? Because we discussed this very important point that one doesn't read Stoic philosophy or philosophy in general for one's own personal benefit. That is not the aim. The aim is I don't know if there's necessarily that aim of philosophy, but what should happen? What is the intent? Is that when one reads it, one understands that one's good is tied in to universal good.
Right. So it's sort of like this emergent perspective that you get.
And that for me was one of the biggest things that I learned. That in this individualistic world that we live in, we all think about ourselves first. We put ourselves first, or whatever is my stake matters. When we realize that everybody's life is all entwined and this is universal good that we should be going through, then we can put Stoic principles to effect to get rid of the burnout, I shouldn't have said burnout. What I meant by that is what the minor irritations and stuff that actually happens in our day to day, the things that actually keep us back from following the common good. Stoic principles help us
perturbations and distractions.
And just that's right, perturbations and distractions. And I think and that's why I feel Stoicism is an antidote to burnout, but not because it makes you indifferent toward your EMR or toward our views. It's because if one reads the Platonic dialogues or Socratic works and understands their role in the common good, then they can use Stoicism to power through these distractions that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So that's where we are right now. As we start the Foundations of the Moral Obligation course, starting next episode, we're going to start with the Platonic dialogues.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about the common good, the way we understood it, the way Socrates wanted us to understand, and then eventually, when we talk about Stoic principles down the line, it would make better sense to someone who's following along. Because when I read Stoicism before I understood what the common good was, I was very confused by it.
Yeah, and common good is a term that we'll have to probably, as we go further along, because I think there's a lot of prerequisite reading that's required to have the kind of the nuanced understanding of what we mean by the common good. But the common good in common parlance is it's either a vague term for some people, and I think for some people it's almost also an ominous term, because it's often used as a mechanism to influence people, and those, we have to be clear that that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is sort of like the deeper human solidarity, sort of the things that morality and virtue aim toward. So, and I think what you're saying is the fact that even Epicurus had done the prerequisite reading before he elaborated his Stoic principles. So we may as well follow the same path. Yes. And the path begins with Plato. Path begins with Plato and his Socratic dialogues. Right. And then we move up from there. And then that way we follow the same, footsteps. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we have a deeper understanding of these ideas that are being iterated by Epicurus, and then moving up from there, because the course goes well beyond that, right?
That's correct. Yeah. It goes into almost the very modern literature. So I think that's pretty much what we had to discuss about this. This is the Courage Under Fire ends with Invictus. Yeah. That I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul.
Right. Yeah.
And what does that mean? I mean, that means that I have control over the things that I can control.
Right.
And that is, in fact, like you said, it is an aspirational goal. One may not reach it, but that is the aim of it. And we hope that through the Foundations course, we can, in fact, be the captains of our soul.
Yeah, absolutely. We've essentially laid out the path. Yeah. We have but to follow it at this point. So in future episodes, we'll actually get into the meat of things and start working through it.
Footsteps of Admiral Stockdale.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
It's great.
We'll leave it there.